So 3 sets of approvals. The state government, Mike Brown with his hard hat on, perhaps to announce that as soon as this week coming. Federal Minister Tony Burke, who was elected on a policy, Federal Labor Election Policy Commitments in the national platform for the most stringent conditions on uranium approvals, to only allow the mining of uranium under world's best practice standards and the most stringent conditions. Does that mean designed to leak? Does it mean dumping tailings out to the surface? Does it mean taking significant ecological risks through water supply? Does that mean having very significant, unnecessary and increased greenhouse gas emissions and vast use of diesel on the side? Is that what the most stringent conditions mean to our federal politicians and our state politicians? The third set of approval that's needed, and there's little talked about at all in our press, is that because they want to change to sell concentrate, because it will now be, most of the copper would go out as a uranium-infused bulk concentrate, they need to amend the treaties with any country, but particularly with China, to provide for that. The proposed sale of uranium-infused concentrate is not sanctioned under any of Australia's nuclear treaties. It wasn't envisaged by previous federal governments. It wasn't envisaged by previous corporations until 2007 when Murray Kloppers took over the reins of BHP and announced that he wanted to change the proposal for the mine operation. So there would have to be a third set of approvals for BHP to be allowed to sell those concentrates. So it may be the case that the federal and the state governments grant approval to something that isn't sanctioned under the foreign affairs powers. Maybe that they grant approval to BHP to go ahead with the mining and operation to sell uranium concentrates at precedent sale without having any treaty approval to do so, without having put any proposal to the federal parliament to ever do so. They are negotiating an amended treaty with China, and that would have to go to a federal parliamentary inquiry. But the company and the state and the federal government are well ahead of those steps. They're assuming that BHP should be given the configuration of the mine that they want to run to best suit their mining interests and their profit margins. And they do that right through to the radiological issues that I've spent much of the last 15 years having some focus on. They do it right through to the climate and the energy and the greenhouse issues. Now, Mike Brand was an early mover on climate change. He brought in some of the first state legislation on climate change by the state government or already principality, regional government around Australia. So what is the Premier lining up to do in terms of the largest mining proposal, the largest open pit mine proposal in Australia? And it will use a vast amount of diesel. This open pit operation will move more than 1 million tonnes of material a day, every day, through a through a 6-year construction period for the pit and for the infrastructure. They're going to move 1 million tonnes of material a day. They're going to use over 1 million litres of diesel a day to do that. It's a vast amount of diesel, a vast amount of greenhouse emissions that come from the diesel use. And it's not just in the 5 or 6 years to dig what they call the pilot pit. You dig down 350 metres to reach the ore, to reach the radioactive ore. But ongoing through decades of proposed mining operations, they keep digging at the same rate. They keep moving material at the same rate of 1 million tonnes a year, 1 million tonnes a day. They keep using 1 million litres of diesel a day for decades to widen and deepen that pit. Now, in an earlier time when Western Mining, WMC, ran Roxby, I went to a conference where one of their executives spoke, and he said, "I'd like to fly across Australia in my plane and look down on the landscape to realise that I only need to peel back the thin veneer of the earth to reveal the mineral resources." This is how they really do think of the ecology and the landscape and the culture in the country. Kevin Buzzacot's country, look at the country. That's how the mining executives view these issues. That's how they view the ecological risks that they would take through the intervention on the land or through the mine water supply. So they're going to peel back 350 metres of the earth just to reveal the ore, just to get to the top of the ore body. They want to continue to dig down to 1 kilometre in that pit. So this diesel use is every year throughout the life of that operation. It has a very significant greenhouse emission, but it also involves currently very significant public subsidies that go to BHP. They get a diesel fuel rebate. They get 18.5 cents a litre less on their diesel pricing than what you, the public, or any other corporation would get. A small business, for instance, would get to buy and use diesel. They would get a public subsidy of some $70 million a year, every year, not just in construction, every year through construction and decades of operation, through the diesel fuel rebate. That's more than the current mining operation pays in royalties. So BHP hands the state government some $60-something million a year in royalties for the total mining operation, the production there of those publicly owned minerals. And when they're building the new proposed pit and on through that operation, the two mines side by side, they take back more with the other hand of the federal government, just in the diesel rebate alone. What sort of a deal is that the feds would be giving the world's largest mining company that's 2/3 overseas owned? It is not the big Australia as it used to be called, as it used to franchise itself in its public relations at an earlier time. It would have a vast increase overall, the pit operations, to offset Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And this is at a time when climate change is a really important public issue. And we have the International Panel on Climate Change saying we need to make urgent deep cuts to our greenhouse emissions. We've all got to take responsibility for this, particularly in the West, in the developing countries. And they talked about, the IPCC talked about needed cuts of 25 to 40% by 2020. And the scientists basically say, unless you can turn around climate change by 2020, you're running really serious risk of dangerous climate change, catastrophic climate change, depending on your approach. The 2 degrees Celsius range, we're likely to be on a track where it would be immensely difficult to get off that track by 2020 unless we make these significant cuts and take the leadership in the West. So what does BHP in South Australia, what does my brand propose to do about that? Well, the company want to increase SA's total gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by about 12% through the one project. One company, one project, one approval, a double figure blowout in South Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions. That would undo all the efforts, all the plans of the individuals, the companies, the corporations for renewable energy, energy efficiency, for changing our ways, for reorganising society and our behaviour, all undone by one company in one project, in one go. And that's what my brand is highly likely to do and approve in the next week or two. The state government haven't taken the steps to make the company lessen their diesel use. The company is not under, as I understand it, any pressure at all from the government to use renewable energy in comparison to their existing plans. And about half of the total greenhouse gas emissions of the whole project, both mines operating side by side, will come from electricity generation, fossil fuel electricity generation, to run those mining operations, to run the conveyors and the crushers and all the big heavy material that can deal with 1 million tonnes of earth a year, earth and rock a year, to power the smelters and the machinery and the processing plants that would use that, whether it would process all of that material. So the state could be saying to BHP, we want this project to leave renewable energy, we want to put in a green grid, we want you to use, to commit that you will use renewable energy and not fossil fuels, not build significantly new gas plants and other facilities, and they could halve the greenhouse gas emissions for the total project proposal. So far there's no public indication that they're willing to do that, but it's the example of the sort of significant change that could happen in Australia if you did have public policy leadership. So facing a state that doesn't have a 2020 climate change target, that's going to agree, it appears, for one company to make a double figure, 12% increase in the total greenhouse gas emissions, what are the little people to do who want to save the planet in terms of climate change and ecology and respect for traditional owners' rights and interests? The whole suite of impacts that come with Roxby Downs are very stark in contrast to the government plans for approval for what BHP will wish to deliver. And there are very significant overseas impacts from the new open pit mine proposal to be the world's largest uranium project. They were both starkly shown, and Philip in the audience today knows them through personal experience, having worked in Japan recently. The Fukushima nuclear disaster demonstrated a lot to people with an interest. It demonstrated that in Japan, the most industrialised, a democratic country, the country with the most technical capability in the world, they were in complete denial about the inherent dangers, the unacceptable dangerous nuclear risks that come with nuclear power plants, that come with the nuclear fuel chain. They were in denial and virtually entirely unprepared and unwilling to have taken the steps to be prepared to deal with any serious combination of accident, mishap that could happen at one of their many nuclear power plants. A combination of natural events, inherent flaws in design, inherent risks in design, and denial and lack of preparedness meant that Japan suffered a massive nuclear catastrophe at Fukushima following the earthquake and the tsunami there. And South Australia, Australia in general, and BHP in particular have a fundamental responsibility to that because Roxby has had long-term uranium contracts with TEPCO, the company that runs the Fukushima nuclear reactors. They run a number of reactors in Japan. It's highly likely that South Australian uranium was involved in the nuclear fuel in at least some of the reactors at Fukushima. And that was one of the very first things that we as ACF said following the Fukushima nuclear disaster. We said, well, our government, our companies are complicit in this nuclear disaster because we fuel the potential for those nuclear disasters. Australian uranium, Roxby uranium, BHP uranium fuels the potential for these nuclear disasters. So we put it on the company and the government to see what response they would make in acknowledging that fact and what responsibility they would take for those issues. The company cited commercial in confidence. They would not reveal the content of any contract with any corporation that used their uranium. The BHP went to the media with confidence in that proposal, and they got away with it in Australia. the federal government basically said, this is a matter for overseas governments and regulatory bodies, and it's not to do with our uranium cells. They were really worried that the public might make the connection between uranium sales and nuclear disasters, between the use of uranium in nuclear power plants and the catastrophes that follow from the use of that uranium, from the use of our uranium, Roxby's and BHP's uranium. The pollies are really worried that the public will ever sufficiently and seriously make those connections, and they are making those connections is a capacity that you in civil society, you as small groups, as individuals, can help bring about. You can bring about that change by recognising that yourself and promulgating that understanding to those that you have access to and influence with in your life and in how you do your own roles in life over time. The broader that understanding is, there is a need for that understanding to become broader, to have an expectation that we can have nuclear-free outcomes in Australia. In facing the bipartisan federal and state political, Labor and Liberal support for the mining industry in general, for Roxby and uranium mining in particular, in facing that and in facing the world's largest mining interests and their vested interests and the way they do that business, it's really only going to be overturned by broad public expectation that these are unacceptable dangers in the nuclear industry that we should no longer be involved with. That's how we will get to where we want to go. A lot of the discussion in the meantime is going to be about the degree of impact and about the conditions under which it might happen or it might be wound back.